Hey guys, so today you and I are going to talk about quality assurance. So let's get into it. So the question in question was, Frederick, is being a software QA as difficult as being a software developer? Well, to cut to the chase, in general, no. Uh, the reason why I say in general no is because the challenges that a QA faces in their daily job varies a lot with the sort of work that they do in the company, because there is a range between what different QAs do in different companies. So, for example, I've worked with QAs who have been primarily doing manual testing. Basically, that's all they did. So what they well, they sat around basically and waited until there was some type of work in their work queue where a developer or a team of developers have shipped a new feature. They go through the story, they try to understand what's going on. I mean, they're involved in the actual planning of the work, so they kind of know what's supposed to be changed, and then they manually test the system, usually on multiple devices and different browsers and so forth, and then they give the feedback to the software developers, and that's most of what they do. And as you can imagine, although that is a process that takes some time, it's a fairly it's a fairly limited scope on what you have to do. You have to understand the feature, you have to understand the system, and you need to have a mindset around how you should test something to see if something breaks. But as a software developer, you have to understand a much bigger picture, if that makes sense. The skills required and the time it will take you to acquire those skills is much, much, much bigger. The fact of the matter is that as a QA, you can you could in theory do that sort of work without any prior training, really. I mean, I'm not saying that you're going to be as effective as the professionals who've been doing it for years, because just as with everything, if you do it, you can do it at different levels. But even someone without any training could be useful as a QA or as a tester, and there are quite a lot of companies who are using QAs in that fashion. But as a software developer, you need basic training. You need, in many cases, it's fairly extensive training. You will not be able to be an effective software developer in less than without any prior training, and usually that training is going to be measured in, at the very, very least, months or more likely years. That is not to say it's not the same thing for QAs at the lower scale of things, but if you go on to the higher scales, it's a similar sort of story. But I think that it is worth knowing that if you work in a company who tries to leverage automated testing, which is a very good thing, there are, in many cases, you will see that the software developers themselves actually are the ones who are taking care of the automated testing and so forth. But in some companies, they actually have dedicated developers or QAs who do this, where they well, in I would actually go as far as to say that they fill a role very similar to the DevOps engineers in some aspects, or site reliability engineers or something like that, where they are developers in the sense that they know how to code, but they may not work on the business logic specifically. What they do is that they help the developers with the delivery process. So if a DevOps engineer is supposed to help a software developer set up a CI pipeline or a CD pipeline or something like that, where they can ship their code and help with all of the infrastructure surrounding the daily work of the software developer and delivery and deployment and all of that good stuff. Well, then a QA engineer who works with test automation, as you can imagine, what they are going to do is that they're going to use their coding skills to make things such as end-to-end testing and integration testing and so forth uh, as effective as possible, because this actually does take a lot of time. And in a very large system, it's actually so time consuming that it might actually make sense to have someone who does this full time, especially if you have a history of negligence or where you've kind of gone light on the automated testing and you kind of need to catch up. It's actually funny because I was interviewing for, this was a while back, interviewing for a position as a consultant for this specific thing at here in my town, where a company had basically asked the consultant agency for a software developer who was really into testing, because they basically needed somebody to write a bunch of tests for the code base. Now that's of course not ideal from the perspective of like TDD and good practices, but if you're in that situation, you're in that situation and you need to figure out how to deal with it. So what I want you to take away from this is that in general, the work of a quality assurance engineer or a QA is, I would not go as far as to say that that is at the same level as a software developer, as that it is as difficult, simply because the work that a software developer has to do potentially, or even at the lowest end, you require more training to be effective at that job. And when you are at the highest levels, you still have to have a lot more information and a lot more knowledge about systems development than a QA technically has to. The bar is a little bit lower to be a QA than it is to be a software developer usually. With that said, on the other hand, if you want to be a QA, you should know that it is a respected profession. It is something that brings value to the IT community. There are people hiring QAs. There is nothing about QA work that is just completely trivial, unless, as I said, you work in at the lowest possible definition, which is just a tester in many cases. And I've worked with people like this, where most of what they do is they don't really have any coding skills. They're not engineers. They're simply people who either had some type of small education or they're completely self-taught, and they test features manually instead of using automated testing, or they test things manually and there are supplements in terms of automated testing. If you wanted to work at the higher ends of QA work, it's very common to see that there are QAs that know coding actually help with automation of the test automation within the system. And in that scenario, you're basically a software developer. In many cases, you may not necessarily require the same level of mastery of software development as a real software developer or someone who does the application logic, but you're very close to the same sort of role. And I actually work with software developers today who used to be QAs. So doing the transition is not something that is beyond you if you wanted to make that switch. Have a great day.